the environmental and social issues concerning development issues, and in particular, the model of development sustainability. Let me first introduce briefly our panelists, and I will start first with Marine Calmet. Marine Calmet is a lawyer by training, a jurist in environmental law and indigenous peoples. She has notably worked as an advocacy officer for the NGO Nature Rights, which is committed to the recognition of the rights of nature and the respect of the rights of the first peoples in the world, and in particular in French Guiana. A spokesperson in France for the collective movement Hors de Question, the citizen collective opposed to the Montagne d'Or project and the mining industry in French Guiana. She pleads for a transformation of our relationship with living beings while respecting planetary limits. In 2019, she founded the NGO Wild Legal, a school for the rights of life, which trains lawyers, new lawyers in particular, each year, annually, to demonstrate the effectiveness of new legal concepts, such as the rights of nature and that of ecocide. Our second panelist, Dr. Hamdou Dorsouma, currently works in the Climate Change and Green Growth Department at the African Development Bank, AFDB, in Abidjan, Côte d'Ivoire. He manages a team of climate change and green growth experts and climate fund coordinators, while coordinating AFDB efforts on climate change in Africa. Previously, Dr. Dorsouma worked at the Sahara and Sahel Observatory, OSS in French, as an expert in environment and climate change. And he then became senior officer in charge of resource mobilization and development partnerships at the World Meteorological Organization in Geneva. So to start with, let me make some preliminary remarks before listening to our two panelists. First of all, one must consider that today's afternoon session, the plenary session we just come from, insists on the importance to combine economical aspects of strong sustainability with ontological, cosmological, anthropological, and historical approaches. The current side session that we are attending now aims at expanding our discussion to the intelligence and legal fields, to the weight of wars and conflicts, and to the consideration of the non-humans and nature at large in the definition of sustainability, well-being, and social links. In other words, this session could be titled differently, and I tried to reframe a little bit the title of the session in this wording. How can fields of knowledge, respectively the environmental intelligence on one hand and the law on the other hand, feed reflection on strong sustainability? Our respective speakers will present two different tools in the fields of technology and law, which contribute to support the concept of strong sustainability. Dr. Dorsouma's paper or presentation shows how armed conflicts affect the development process and how environmental intelligence can be an additional solution to attain economic and social sustainability, which in return contributes to peace and security. And I quote Dr. Dorsouma, environmental intelligence provides leaders and managers with a strategic analysis tool and decision-making process to anticipate and manage the risk associated with conflict situations with the view of safeguarding sustainability. In that sense, environmental intelligence represents an innovative tool to achieve strong sustainability, not only in fighting Earth exhaustion, but also in solving conflict situations. As I invite you, Dr. Dorsouma, to start, please feel free to launch your presentation, and I will make a short presentation of Madame Calmet's presentation later on. So the floor is yours. Please go ahead.
Thank you very much for your kind introduction. I am about to share my screen. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay.
Just maybe one additional information for you. You may be entitled to speak more than 20 minutes. You can go up to 30 minutes for your presentation, if you feel so.
All right, but in any case, I'm going to make it short, just to give us more time for discussions at the end of the presentation, which is actually not that long. Thank you. The title of the presentation is about achieving the strong sustainability in the context of armed conflicts in Africa and the role of environmental intelligence. This is a joint paper between myself and Professor Michel-André Bouchard from the McGill University in Canada. The aim of this presentation actually is to take us through some of the issues and suggestions we have come across during a recent research that we have conducted over the last 2-3 years on the nexus between conflict and sustainability. So the outline of the presentation, as it is shown here, is first to introduce the concept, the issue, the paper, and then this will be followed by a general overview on the nexus between conflict and sustainability. After that, I'm going to quickly introduce the concept of environmental intelligence as an analytical framework to address the nexus between conflict and sustainability. This will be followed by a couple of applications in Africa. The first one is about post-conflict sustainability planning in Côte d'Ivoire. And then the second one will be an overall approach for regional security sustainability for West Africa, before I talk broadly about an Africa-wide coordinated response to the nexus between conflict and sustainability before I conclude. As a way of introduction, let me first say that armed conflicts result in direct and indirect impacts on development in general, including decline of economic growth, deterioration of social conditions, as well as environmental damages. In Africa in particular, several countries have already been affected by conflicts. Others are still in conflict situations, and these result in aggravation of poverty and erosion of the hard-won development gains achieved by African countries over the last decade. In the continent, armed conflicts have already hampered ability to achieve the Millennium Development Goals from the period 2000 to 2015. So the paper that we are presenting today aims at addressing the nexus between security and sustainability issues with associated risk and implications in Côte d'Ivoire in particular, but also by extension to West Africa and Africa as a whole. So the key question here is, how can environmental intelligence provide a solution for achieving strong sustainability in the context of conflicts in Africa? So let me then touch on the nexus between conflict and sustainability. As you may already know, the world is less peaceful than during the last decade, with the increased number of conflicts and the exacerbation of the global insecurity in the world currently. And the consequences of armed conflicts are grouped into 3 categories, according to a paper Professor Bouchard and myself have published 16 years ago. And these 3 categories are pre-conflict impacts, in-conflict impacts, as well as post-conflict impacts. In terms of economic losses, we identify destruction of infrastructure, disruption of agricultural cycles, etc. In terms of social impacts, these include loss of human lives, migration, humanitarian disasters, etc. And in terms of environmental damages, these include largely illicit trafficking, overexploitation and degradation of natural resources, also the dumping of hazardous military waste in the environment, water poisoning during wars, etc. Overall, armed conflicts are compromising already the progress towards achieving the 2030 Sustainable Development Goals of the United Nations. So in this context, how can environmental intelligence play a role as an analytical framework? First of all, let me also mention that environmental intelligence has emerged recently in response to the pressing environmental risk in the world. A noter, Casas, defines it recently as a systematic information management tool for planning and decision-making for the purposes of environmental protection and sustainable development. Since 1992, this concept is being viewed in the United States in particular as the strategic use of environmental information for scenario planning in preparation of complex situations such as climate change, nuclear attacks, etc. It is also considered as a risk management framework in order to cope with increasingly uncertain futures and new types of risk, including terrorism. So based on our analysis done in that paper that we presented, we came across a three-dimensional framework that categorizes or defines environmental intelligence. These three dimensions are a preventive dimension, a prospective dimension, and a reactive dimension. So in this table, you can see that the main purpose of this framework is to use environmental intelligence for sustainability planning in conflict situations. So when you look into that in the context of the three dimensions, we see that for the preventing dimension, the focus is largely on early warning in order to prevent conflicts and also to identify pre-conflict measures in anticipation of any situations, and to raise awareness of stakeholders on how this is going to affect sustainability. In terms of prospective dimension, the focus is largely on making diagnostic and strategic analysis on the implications of security on sustainability agenda. The second aspect is about scenario building and sustainable development visioning, planning, and budgeting. And of course, as a prospective dimension, include also developing and monitoring conflict sustainability scenarios. I'm going to present a couple of them in my next slide. And for the reactive dimension, the focus is largely on conflict risk analysis. Reactive meaning that in the context when conflict is already going on, what shall we do? We need to do a quick risk analysis of the conflict. We need to have in place a risk management process and have a crisis response approach. And one of the responses will be to safeguard the environment, and in that regard, we need an environmental governance process in place. And this results actually into three key options for sustainability. The first one being anticipative sustainability actions. When we are not yet in conflict, how shall we do to anticipate that sustainability will be at stake? And the second one is about scenario planning and strategy recommendations. What can be the scenarios that we can put forward in order to anticipate any conflict situations? And of course, the last one is, in case the conflict happens, what shall we do to manage the risks that are going to affect sustainability? So a couple of applications, as I mentioned earlier, include a case study that we conducted in Côte d'Ivoire for post-conflict sustainability planning. As you may know, Côte d'Ivoire was affected by armed conflict from 2000 to 2011, and this was followed by several other conflict situations, including terrorism attack in 2016, and all of those have posed significant sustainability risk on the country. So we looked into two categories of scenarios. The first category is about conflict-related scenarios, and we came up with 3 scenarios. The first one is what we call total peace, which anticipates a country away from armed conflicts. And the second sub-scenario here is about relative peace, which anticipates a country partially affected by conflict situations. And another sub-scenario here is about conflict, which anticipates a country affected by a long period of conflict. The second sub-scenario is on the sustainability issues. The first one being here the strong sustainability scenario, whereby we anticipate that Côte d'Ivoire will be able to achieve all the sustainable development goals by 2030. The second sub-scenario here is about weak sustainability, whereby the country can only achieve part of the SDGs, and of course, what we call the zero sustainability scenario, which is the inability of the country to achieve sustainability by 2030. And when we combine those two sub-scenarios, we came up with 3 key scenarios for the country. The first one is the one we call the emergence of the elephant being the symbol of Côte d'Ivoire, as you may know. So this is an optimistic and best case scenario, which anticipates a country in peace and able to achieve all the SDGs, all the 17 Sustainable Development Goals by 2030. The second scenario is what we call the elephant with clay feet, which anticipates a country affected by conflict situations, which may affect its likelihood to achieve sustainability. And this is, as I said, a realistic scenario following the recent trends of conflicts in the country. And the last scenario is a pessimistic and worst case scenario, which is named here the decline of the elephant, which anticipates a country affected by a long period of conflict, which will compromise its ability to achieve the SDGs by 2030. Another example is, by extension, if you look into that Côte d'Ivoire is in West Africa, and conflicts currently in one country in the region have the ability to affect the other countries. So we need, by extension, to look into what could happen in the region in general. And I'm citing here a quote from the International Crisis Group that says that armed conflicts in West Africa are progressing like the desert from north to the south. And this is exactly what we saw recently in West Africa. We see here in this region 2 corridors of conflict. The conflict in Mali, for instance, which is posing a crucial security risk in all the countries in the Sahel. And this conflict has emerged from the war in Libya in 2011. And currently, those countries that are suffering the most from this conflict situation are those countries in the Sahel, which are ranked below Human Development Index by UNDP. And the second corridor is a conflict in the Lake Chad Basin by the Boko Haram group. And this conflict has transformed the region into a major insecurity hotspot. So in West Africa in general, armed conflicts are leading to significant military expenses. Currently, they represent, on average, 30% of national budgets. And this results in a limited headroom for those countries to invest in sustainability projects. So there is a need here for a comprehensive approach, regional approach, to address the risk, the conflict, and the security and sustainability risk in West Africa in a more integrated way, beyond the national individual responses by countries. So this calls for a regional environmental intelligence system for the region, for West Africa, building on the existing ECOWAS early warning response network, which is created in 2008, but which is being used only to resolve conflicts when they emerge. But the concept here of regional environmental intelligence goes beyond just conflict resolution to also do conflict prevention and also provide a framework to address them within the context of sustainability planning of the region and in the countries of the region. So when we look into the concept as in the continent in general, in Africa in general, we believe there is a need for an Africa-wide coordinated response to security and sustainability issues. Because currently, most of the conflicts in Africa are cross-border conflicts, and the terrorism that is going on in the continent has an international nature, and this combines with the impact of the Russia-Ukraine war that is already happening, and all of that has incidences on Africa's sustainability agenda. For this reason, we need really an Africa-wide coordinated response. We need, therefore, to explore innovative ways of investing in sustainability and prioritizing sustainability, taking into consideration security risks that are already happening in this region, in this continent. We have proposed actually to establish an African financing facility to invest in strong sustainability projects, including conflict prevention systems. How can we strengthen them? How can we strengthen national security architecture? How can we finance post-conflict reconstruction in those countries that are already being affected by conflicts, and how we can invest in sustainable and resilient infrastructure? And this calls for innovative ways of providing sovereign guarantees, for instance, to de-risk sustainable development investment in order to attract investors to invest in conflict-affected countries. And this also includes reorienting national budgets towards more sustainability programs, away from the current expensive and ineffective military expenditures that are affecting investment on a sustainability agenda. So let me conclude by saying that achieving strong sustainability in conflict situations requires a holistic and comprehensive approach. In Africa in particular, this is critical in order to avoid a setback towards achieving the Sustainable Development Goals by 2030. Therefore, environmental intelligence provides a framework for ensuring strong sustainability by anticipating potential conflict risks, safeguarding development outcomes, and more importantly, mainstreaming security risks into the sustainability agenda. We need to rethink the current conflict resolution and response measures towards a continent-wide approach which puts sustainability in the center of Africa's security and development agenda. By creating an Africa Security Sustainability Financing Facility, we'll provide an opportunity for the continent to overcome the challenges posed by the displacement of limited national budgetary resources to address military responses. In conclusion, we propose that we believe that the global community has also an important role to play in helping Africa to promote promoting an international security sustainability approach in the spirit of shared prosperity and global cooperation. Let me stop here and thank you again for your kind attention.
Thank you very much for your presentation. I think that we still have a lot of questions to ask you, in particular around the concept of environmental intelligence. But for the time being, I will leave the floor now to Marine Calmet. And before that, as I did with you, I will first introduce her with a few elements before she makes a presentation. So it is important to say that in a rather long and interesting preface to the French version of an article by Christophe Stone, Should Trees Have Standing? Towards Legal Rights for Natural Objects. It was published in 1970 or something, yeah. Marine Calmet urges us to transform radically our relationship to the living and to other living beings. Following Christopher Stone, she explored a new perspective in the history of law and supports the beginning of what we call a legal transition compared to what we know about the legal, the just transition. So it's a kind of play on words here. But in such legal transition, I quote, "The recognition of the rights of nature is part of the continuity of the struggles for the rights of women and colonized peoples." So I guess that Marine Calmet will describe in a presentation the evolution of the law recently about the rights of nature, and she's invited also to explain if possibly how both environmental law and environmental ethic could also contribute to support the definition of and the expansion and the consolidation of the concept of strong sustainability, and also help to redesign widely social life and harmony, as it was mentioned in the title. So please, Marine, the floor is yours now.
Thank you. So exactly 50 years ago, the same year as the publication of the Meadows report, an article was published which does not yet have the same visibility, but which I am sure also marked a civilizational turning point. This is Christopher Stone's article, "Should Trees Have Standing?", a book in which the American academic defends for the first time the possibility of recognizing a legal status and rights for nature. For this, he returns to the history of the rights of persons, recalling that for a very long time, neither slaves nor colonized people enjoyed a status equal to that of the white man. Slaves were indeed the property of their masters. They could be bought, sold, and exploited for their labor power, deprived of their most fundamental rights for reasons very often economical reasons, farm labor in particular. He recalls that until recently, the status of woman was also subservient to that of the man, placing her under the guardianship of the husband or the father. She had the same legal status as the insane and children. And did you know that in France, the very same year the Meadows report was published and the article written by Christopher Stone, a major event illustrated the intrinsic link between the oppressed status of women and that of nature? Indeed, in 1972, Gisèle Halimi, the famous lawyer, made her plea for the right to abortion and said before the court composed entirely of men, "Do you know, gentlemen, that the drafters of the Civil Code in their preamble had thus described the fate of woman? A woman shall be given to a man in order to bear his children. She is therefore his property, as the fruit tree is that of the gardener." There is the fundamental point. Women had no right to dispose of themselves. In this manner, I wanted to call your mind a certain vision of capitalistic development that has long taken advantage of a dominant status in order to derive benefits from the bodies of rationalized people, women, and earth. This is also why, after taking a step back from the history of attribution of personality and fundamental rights to other entities, we must address the question of respect for the rights of non-human. And the question is to think for and through nature a new age of enlightenment. In order to be sustainable, shouldn't the development model also be sought and enviable for humans and non-humans alike, in the form of a new social contract, a natural contract, as the French philosopher Michel Serge called it? Because the challenge we are currently facing is to invent a new common destiny, a safe future for man and for nature, a biomimetic law system respectful of the vital symbiosis within planetary ecosystems. As the work of COP15 on biodiversity will begin this Wednesday, Antonio Guterres, the UN Secretary General, recalled yesterday in Montreal that humanity has become a weapon of mass extinction. and that it is time to stop our war on nature. This is not only a question of finding an economic model of sustainable development, but of signing a non-aggression pact with non-humans to guarantee harmony with nature. Environmental protection was developed in silos: environmental code, forest code, mining code, in the same way as the 2030 agenda adopts categorized goals: zero hunger, health, energy. This method sometimes leads to absurd results. So to satisfy the need for so-called renewable energy, laws can authorize the cutting of forests and the planting of monocultures for timber, causing increased competition for access to land and food production, while in reality contributing to climate change through destruction of natural carbon sinks and massive extinction of biodiversity. By this example, I wanted to show how current models and laws are structurally incapable of interpreting interdependencies and interactions that drive the functioning of living ecosystem where water, soil, trees, animals collectively participate in a symphony that we can neither apprehend nor capture with our current legal instruments. Recognizing the rights of nature and all of the living entities that compose it is a prerequisite in order to create a model that is no longer anthropocentric, but bio-perspectivist, capable of integrating the standing and the needs of non-humans. Climate change sets off a cascade of consequences, something that is very new and triggers conflicts around the use of territory. Dissent in civil society may go as far as blockages and other actions of civil disobedience. It is therefore necessary to adopt a new form of governance in which the rights of nature entities can be both expressed, heard, and considered. This involves imagining models of local and biodynamic democracy so that guardians of the rights of nature can actively participate in public policies. As you can see on this picture, just as human beings have human rights, all other beings have also rights which are specific to their species or kinds and appropriate for their role and function within the community within which they exist. That's Article 1 of the Universal Declaration of the Rights of Mother Earth, written and adopted in 2010 Cochabamba. Liberal thought have tried to impose a vision according to which nature could benefit from the protection of private property, because the owner of a good manager, would necessarily be led to preserve his property in order to derive the maximum benefit from it. With insights, it is clear that this dogma has in fact only resulted in outrageous speculation and the squandering of our common heritage for mostly non-essential needs. The recognition of the rights of nature requires the redefinition of the limits of human actions toward living organisms. This does not imply the prohibition of any form of impact on nature, of course. It's not a question of forbidding from now on the cutting of trees, the eating of animals, but of introducing into our criteria for action the assessment that the impact on the rights of other non-human living organisms in order to appreciate the opportunity of our choice, no longer solely through the prism of human interests. In this way, recognizing the rights of nature, also defining a complementary approach to development within planetary limits, integrating not only respect for the major mechanism of ecological stability, but also the guarantee for the fundamental rights of other non-human entities. By creating the right condition for the birth of a new ecological ethic, new processes such as sobriety and regeneration could thus develop by competing with short-term productivity-oriented motivations. I will come to my second part. The first principle set out by AFD relating to the non-substitutability between different types of economic, social, and natural capital as the basis for strong sustainability has certain advantages over the weak sustainability model. but neither the strong sustainability model nor the weak one ultimately breaks with the capitalist vision, according to which nature is a fungible resource, exchangeable according to human criteria, and can be protected by financial strategies like payment for ecosystem service, green bonds, biodiversity offsets, or carbon credits. This is incompatible with the bio-perspective vision, where the own personality and individuality of each natural entity is intrinsic rights to integrity is an obstacle for compensation. Ecosystems are coherent, interdependent, unique, and singular communities. Such a reality makes it impossible for any comparison and therefore any compensation, except, on the contrary, starting from the postulate that it is possible to proceed to the destruction of ecosystems in the name of a monetary system of greater importance than life itself. Within the avoid, reduce, compensate sequence, this vision, according to which nature would be a compensable capital tool, often leads to the initial obligation to avoid and reduce any impact on nature to be ignored. Instead, technological projects are devised, a solution-based approach incapable of ensuring the good ecological state of our ecosystem in the long term. In France, for example, the possibility of compensating the ecological degradation caused during the development of projects, in particular by new infrastructure, photovoltaic fields, industrial zones, etc., lead to several problems. Artificialization is progressing. Between 20 and 30 hectares are 1,000 hectares are artificialized each year. That means that artificialization is increasing almost 4 times faster than the population is growing. There are no longer enough resources to compensate for the impact of activities that are harmful to nature, leading to competition on the land, aggravating conflicts of use. And some destructions are so serious that they cannot be compensated, and they are still authorized. So the discrepancy between the measure proposed by the industrials with the agreement of the state and the degree of harm caused to nature may be considerable. It is so far necessary to question the sustainability of substitutability, of natural elements, and therefore contest a capitalistic and accounting vision of nature. So we must lead to this question of interspecies equality and solidarity, because faced with climate change, talking about sobriety or limiting impacts is already outdated. And we must think about development capable of restoring and regenerating natural resources and ecological balances. In France, most of the administrative authorities responsible for the environment today only have an advisory role, and they are not listened to when they sound the alarm. This is particularly the case of the High Authority for Climate, which has not been heard by the government despite its severe analysis of the climate and resilience law. This is also the case of the Environmental Authority, which in the person of its president expressed concern on the occasion of a report related in May 2022, the ecological transition has not begun in France, and if we do not anticipate it, the planetary limits and the effects of non-compliance will impose themselves in an implacable way. So in order to guarantee that economic, social, and environmental development is shared, we must include interspecies equality and solidarity, and to achieve this, a new governance approach must be developed, which includes scientific analysis of ecological state indicators, existing environmental risk and appropriate restoration measures, but also representation of the interest of nature in public policies and development projects, development of local governances that respect the cultural, history, and specific needs of the population concerned, oversights of compliance with the rights of nature, and information and participation of the public, of course. And I wanted to show 2 examples related to the recognition of Marine and 1 example in Ecuador. So short time ago. There is the first case in Europe of recognition of rights of nature. Marmenor is a lagoon marine ecosystem with an area of 135 square kilometers. It is the largest coastal lagoon on the Spanish Mediterranean coast. However, the increased impact of human activities on the conservation of the Marmenor has been the subject of studies highlighting a sharp deterioration in its state of health since the 60s due to the convergence of several phenomena, in particular urbanization, and the intensification of agricultural activities responsible for eutrophication of this fragile ecosystem. And following several episodes of massive fish deaths in the Marmenor, local residents with an historical and cultural attachment to this ecosystem took action, bringing together neighborhood association, environmental organizations, professional groups, and cultural foundations to demand that measures be taken to restore and preserve the lagoon. A popular legislative initiatives were launched, a mechanism of participatory democracy allowing citizens, if they collect more than 500,000 signatures in favor of a bill, to present to Parliament. The Marmenor obtained more than 650,000 signatures in favor of the recognition of its rights. So on September 30 of this year, the law of the recognition of the legal personality of the Marmenor lagoon was adopted. The lagoon goes from going of simple objects of protection to that of a being of inseparably biological, environmental, cultural, and spiritual subjects. So the Marmenor and its basin now have rights, and in particular the right to protection, conservation, maintenance, and when it's appropriate, restoration. And the lagoon is represented by 3 councils, which together form the legal guardianship for the lagoon. The objective of this mobilization is to strengthen public and private responsibility for the protection of the natural environment, and at the same time, enhance the rights of people who live in the lagoon area and who are threatened by ecological degradation in order to guarantee their so-called biocultural rights. And the second example is in South America, the example of Los Cedros jurisprudence in Ecuador. The Los Cedros Reserve in northwest Ecuador has more than 4,800 hectares of forests, 84% of which is primary tropical forest, and the reserve is home to a great biodiversity of plants and animals, feline frogs, and in particular, a highly endangered species of brown-headed spider monkey that you can see on this picture. In a decision of November 10, 2021, the Constitutional Court of Ecuador recognized that the mining authorization granted by the government over approximately 2/3 of this forest were unconstitutional and violated the rights of nature protected by the constitution of the country. The court found that the government had not provided sufficient evidence to demonstrate the compatibility of mining activities with the protection of this fragile ecosystem. Faced with the absence of a satisfactory environmental study, the highest court in the country considered that these projects were incompatible with the rights of the Los Cedros Reserve to exist and regenerate. The court also recalled that the lack of prior environmental study and consultation of local communities by the government violated the rights of these communities to healthy environment, to water, and to prior consultation. So the objective of this jurisprudence is to recall the constitutional obligation to protect the rights of nature, which is therefore also binding on the state, and put an end to human activities that, especially in mining cases, which shouldn't be developed in territories with the biodiversity and ecological balance are threatened. There are just 2 of the most representative examples of a movement that wins around 20 new cases of recognition of rights of nature around the world every year. There are now cases everywhere from Ecuador to Uganda, from Australia to New Zealand, and from Spain to Canada, for example, because it makes it possible to recast legislation in support of a truly sustainable development model for humans and for non-humans. The rights of nature movement is, I hope, a path that will be explored widely by project developers. In this regard, I'm very happy also to be able to announce that a publication project has been launched by IAD and should see the light of day before the summer of next year. So our work is part of a reflection that aims to establish bridges between conventional human rights, rights to a healthy environment, and the rights of nature, to provide concrete tools for AFD in this area, as well as to the community of development stakeholders. I thank you for your attention, and I of course remain to your disposal for questions.
Well, thank you very much indeed, both of you. I think we have a lot of food for thinking, for questions, for everything. So before having the privilege, but I will not exercise my privilege to launch the round of questions. I will ask the floor, maybe whether here in the room or on the line, for questions that you may have for both our panelists. So maybe within the room first, do we have questions? Please.
To speak in French, maybe? No?
Maybe we could, but we then translate, because there is no translator on the line. So
okay, sorry. Maybe just one precision on the paper of Marine, sorry. For the first example on last seminar, is it also a local law? Or
it's a national law voted by Parliament and published by the government.
Okay.
With signature of the government.
Okay, and maybe the worldwide, can we extend that case in on another country, or I don't know? Yeah, if you have another example on maybe in the African continent or something like that.
2019, Uganda took a law and rights of environment, and which recognizes the possibility of granting rights for nature. So it's also already recognized the personality of nature, okay, and the possibility for citizens to act for protecting the rights of nature, okay, in Uganda. Okay. And there are civil mobilization. I heard also in Congo, okay, in like France and Europe. It's not just the place where there are most jurisprudences or laws, because historically South of America is very well represented, also by increased impact of indigenous law and indigenous mobilization, especially on the water, and against mining industries and oil industries. So, and there is this cultural impact of the cosmovision of Pachamama, the Andean representation of the Mother Earth, which plays a very important role that you can also find very present in North America, Canada, and US, where the movement is also very well represented, with around 50 jurisprudences or law recognizing locally in reserve on indigenous land or non-indigenous land rights to rivers, especially on the thematic of barrage, hydroelectric dams.
Yeah. I have a question too for Dorsouma. Could you define environmental intelligence?
Can I reply now?
Yes, of course.
Thank you. I think in one of my slides, I attempted to provide a definition by Casas, 2017. That's the latest definition we got from literature on this concept, which says that environmental intelligence is a tool, a risk management tool for planning and decision making for the purposes of environmental protection and sustainable development. So it is a tool that is being used to address environmental protection issues, including as well as sustainable development. But you may recognize that the concept is quite new, and what we have done, Professor Bouchard and myself, is to look into the concept in terms of how it can help solve some of the conflict-related issues that have implications on sustainability. So applying it in that particular context has enabled us to come up with a framework that could help, address security and sustainability issues in 3 dimensions. So in that particular context, we consider environmental intelligence as a 3-dimensional framework, a preventive approach, a proactive, prospective approach, and then a reactive approach. So, but again, those 3 dimensions are not have to work together, because in a particular country, for instance, in the case of Côte d'Ivoire, you need both a preventive approach, because even though the country is no longer in conflict situation, it might be affected maybe in the future by conflicts. So we need a preventive approach. We also need a prospective approach, because currently the country has a strategic direction for the next 20 years. By 2040, the country has a vision. So how we consider conflicts as something that is going to affect the realization of that vision. So we need, of course, to have a prospective approach. That's the reason why we came across those 3 scenarios that I have presented in my slide today. But again, you also need a reactive dimension in case, despite your preventive approach, despite your prospective approach, a conflict happens. What do? You don't need to be taken by surprise. So you may need to think about those measures you need to put in place in case conflict happens. These include what I mentioned in my presentation, a risk analysis process, a risk management and crisis response approach to help you mitigate the risk when they happen. One example is when there is conflict, there is a migration. People have to move, and people have to save their life, and they have to look for livelihoods. So in Côte d'Ivoire, for instance, we have observed that people have, especially in the rural areas, people have moved to protected areas, to natural reserves, to look for food, to look for water, etc. And also, and this has affected the fauna, because people have relied on the wildlife for their livelihoods. And these has significant implications on environmental protection in these in those particular protected areas. So reactive approach is also needed, but this will help you really ensure, for instance, that in case conflict happens, you already know where you are going to help people migrate. In order to let people go to protected areas, you may need to think about locations whereby the environmental impacts will be mitigated. So this is the way we see it, and of course this is still work in progress. It will continue to further deepen it with additional case studies in that particular area. Thank you.
Maybe in line, well, yes, I will exercise my privilege now, but I know that you want to ask a question. In line with what you said, what you just said, in your paper, at the end of your paper, it was a slide before your conclusion, you plead for, if I remember, a regional environmental intelligence system for West Africa, or maybe for Africa at large, as a coordinated response to the security and sustainability challenges. And my question is, according to you, what are the chances to see such mechanism becoming concrete, becoming real, becoming true, and how such mechanism could be endorsed and supported, not only by the regional bodies that you mentioned, but also, and including AFDB, maybe, but also by external donors like the development banks and maybe AFD or World Bank or other donors. It would be interesting to know at what stage is this process of implementation. Is it just explore or implement or develop or whatever? So can you, and what are the financial issues related to your regional initiative, to say so?
Thank you for this series of questions. Let me take them one by one. What are the chances to see this mechanism established? For instance, in Côte d'Ivoire, let me take a national context before coming to the regional dimension. In Côte d'Ivoire, for instance, the country has recently established what they call the National Security Council. And this is, and what I have made a presentation to that council, I think a few months ago, and I see that the National Security Council is not only looking into, the traditional security aspects, like, how can we protect the borders, etc., or how can we strengthen, security forces? No, they are trying to look into security in a holistic way. They are also considering how environmental degradation could be considered as a national security issue. So this gives you already a sense that they are close to consider environmental intelligence as an approach, because environmental intelligence helps you really, broaden your definition or your approach of security, so that when, for instance, an area is completely degraded, what happens? People have to move, or people rely on the nature because they will continue to aggravate the environmental degradation because they need to feed themselves. So you need to come up with an approach in order to avoid that environment could be, the victim of such a situation. So I see that at national level, a national security council, which is open to have a holistic approach towards security, is already a means towards us having a national intelligence system working at national level. Now, at regional level, at West Africa level or Africa level, I mentioned the case of West Africa because I have mentioned that ECOWAS early warning system that is already existing. So instead of reinventing the wheel, the idea here is to strengthen that existing early warning system to make it more holistic and more proactive, because so far it is focusing only on the reactive dimension of environmental intelligence, as I mentioned earlier. They need now to include, to embed those other two dimensions, the preventive dimension, but also the prospective dimension. So I think the infrastructure is already there. The system has been already created, but there are some elements that are missing. So the approach here is to strengthen it and to make it more proactive. And instead of waiting for a conflict to happen before activating the system could already, work. And currently, what we observe when studying that system, it relies on national systems. So, but the issue is, the main question here is about information sharing, because for national security issues, countries are not sharing information to the regional system. So that is a challenge, but I believe that with strong, regional cooperation, this challenge could be overcome in the future. We already see that between countries, it's already happening. For instance, recently between Cote d'Ivoire and Burkina Faso, they share a same border, and the terrorist attacks in the border in Burkina Faso also affects Cote d'Ivoire. So the two countries have signed an MOU, a memorandum of understanding, to manage the situation that happens in the border, in the shared borders. So it's already a fact, an evidence of the way they could already start, implementing a regional approach for environmental intelligence. Now, what would be your next point about how can this be endorsed? Of course, instead of making it as a standalone system, our approach is that it has to be linked to the existing national and regional bodies so that it is embedded into an existing process. So I think that's the only way we see this could be endorsed by countries, but also by regional bodies like the ECOWAS, the Economic Commission for West Africa. The role of the donors. Donors have an important role to play to really support countries because, especially an institution like the African Development Bank, we are investing in all 54 African countries, and many of those countries are conflict affected. But yet you need to invest in those countries. How do you make sure that you safeguard your investments and that the countries also, those countries that are in conflict could also continue to benefit from development finance? So you need to come up with some structure in place to do that. And that's the reason why we have proposed to have an Africa-wide financing facility to help invest in conflict-affected countries, because those countries have a lot of challenges, development challenges, security challenges, etc. But we cannot leave them alone. So donors, financing institutions have an important role to play, but for that to happen, you need to put some safeguards in place. And I believe environmental intelligence provides a framework for donors to also invest in those countries. And by investing, public donors like us or, bilateral donors, when they invest in such countries, they could create a space for other private investors also to come, because what private investors need, they need security, they need guarantee, they need the enabling environment. So we could create that enabling environment for private investors to also continue to invest in sustainability projects in those countries. Despite they are in conflict, there's still room for investment in those countries. Finally, I think there are financial issues, of course. How do we finance environmental intelligence? That is the big elephant in the room. National budget cannot do it itself. As we can see, most African countries have limited budgets, and they have competing priorities, competing demands, and environmental intelligence could not be maybe at the current stage a priority. But that's the reason why, for instance, in our study for Cote d'Ivoire, we suggested a national facility. We can put a levy. Maybe you can tax some polluting activities, to create a fund, a national fund that could be there, a sovereign fund that could be there, or you can use an existing sovereign fund in the country in order to get additional resources from other sources, not only the national budget, in order to support such activities. For instance, how can we strengthen, even training, how can you train the national forces, the military forces on sustainability issues? So I think there is a lot of innovations to be done in that space, especially to overcome the financial challenges that are there, but it requires some innovation. And those innovations can only be brought by donors and financing institutions like us, which have experience in investing in such countries and in Africa in general. I thank you.
Thank you very much. Another question.
Yes, I have a question for Marine. So in the different examples you gave about rights given to the environment, was each time a right given to quite a large entity, an ecosystem or a particular area, and those rights were each time given as a reaction to industrial projects in order to protect that area or that ecosystem from the project. And so is this the kind of organic development rights to nature that you recommend, just having a reactive approach and creating progressively rights and see where that leads us? Or do you envision other approaches to give rights to nature?
Actually, most of the time, it's a right is created by an impulse of society. It's also the case for women's rights or for abolition of slavery. It's a cultural aspect that is translated into rights, and civil society was always at the starting point of reconsidering the status quo and going further in developing a society where other people, other entities are represented. That's globally the historical way how law is developing. Because globally, first of all, it was only a law dictated enunciation by the Occidental forces that was colonizing other countries, where nowadays these countries, especially in South America, are saying it's not okay anymore to have this colonizing people imposing or multinationals imposing their way of doing business on our land. And so yeah, most of the time it's also there is a protest, there is something that leads people to say this law system is unjust. It leads to the destruction of nature. It leads to the destruction and the impossibility to guarantee human rights. So we are the first victims of it. And so because the situation is not okay anymore, or is not it's not compatible with the vital and ecological necessity of people living there, they are fighting back. So yeah, it's obvious that it's the way the thing starts. But I think with the development of rights of nature, it will most probably become also a global movement and not just local mobilization. But the difficulty is we are in the moment when you normally call it like proof of concept. We have to prove that this concept really leads to a global bonus for people locally, so that it will really ensure that rights of nature and also rights of humans are guaranteed under this new legislation. So that's why I think we need to have like feedbacks. We have need to show that it's the proof of concept is positive, and for sure it will then it will be replicated on a national and international level. And there are discussions at international level, for example, on the recognition of ecocide in front of the international court, international criminal court, to think about legal instruments to have pursuit legal actions against people who are endangering nature or actually harming nature. And I think the objectives like we can have is that we find also on an international level, especially on commons like the open sea or also on the Amazon, solutions that are also shared by the international community. But now, and also in the perspective of the actual diplomatic situation, who you can see is very unstable, and where you have forces that are leading conflicts on the international level with Ukraine, Russia, and other countries, that it's very difficult to see how we can achieve an international accord, diplomatic way to implement rights of nature on an international way. But I'm very impressed how this local mobilization leads to not only local laws or regulation, but they achieve to obtain the introduction of rights of nature inside law system, a national level, but also on constitutional level, like in Ecuador, because it was a referendum led by civil society in 2008. So civil society massively voted for the introduction of rights of nature inside Ecuador's constitution. And that's a massive thing. I mean, it's not like a local mobilization. It was a response, obviously, to Texaco Chevron and also other criminal and ecological scandals that were that affected this territory. But it also shows that civil society, like in Spain, can really be acting to change the local law system, the global laws.
Before we close the session, because we still have 6 to 5 minutes left, I would like to share a question from online question, and I quote: "Today we witness a worrying expansion of fossil fuel industry, mainly for the benefit of northern countries and the local elites in Africa. Despite the scientific available data that no more projects should be developed to limit climate warming. These new projects have a huge impact on nature, ecocide, that you just mentioned, and human rights. What are, and this is a question, what are the best options to stop this dynamic that will lock Africa in a long-term carbon economy system?" Not only Africa, I may say, but mainly Africa. So I'm repeating the question: what are the best options, according to you, to stop this dynamic that would lock Africa in a long-term carbon system?
I think it's a multidimensional question and problematic, but one of the key answers on my side will be to start from the climate necessity of stopping emissions, so that we know today that we should keep more than 50% of the oil inside the ground, and that so in fact we should plan going back from fossil fuel and oil. So we should definitely plan the end of this use by sharing like a common this common good with all humanity, because the problem is, as it was said in the question, that most of this fossil fuel is used in the north and extracted from the south. And it's a real challenge to find another balance that is suitable for these countries, not to be faced another crisis, a humanitarian crisis, by taking this money from them and from the next generation who could benefit from this money, but also to see the impossibility for our planet to face this climate crisis, also with these interactions with our rights. So for me, it's all a question of planification. We know how many fossil fuel we can burn left without facing the climate crisis, and we should not consider that oil is a product, a market product, but that oil is a common that we can only use in a very particular way, shared for essential needs and not for what we are doing today. That means unnecessary use, disproportionate use. And for this, we have to plan our, for example, the scientists working on planetary boundaries are saying that the only just way to go back from fossil fuel is to invest massively in commons. And with that, they mean common public transport, common use of energy and things like that, because if we still think that oil is an individual property, it can be used on the market, and it can be sold, and it means no regulation at all. So it's like I was saying also on forests, on water, it must be considered as a common where we together decide how we have a respectful use of it.
Thank you. That's a very interesting opening and perspective. And it might be interesting also to see, and it's not a question, but maybe a comment on the fact that in that sense, environmental intelligence in a way can also be considered as a common in the future, and not only as a kind of not only a management tool, but a common, that is to say, a tool that could be governed, whose rules can be decided together collectively, as you mentioned, Dr. Dorsouma. So I think we have come to an end. 1 minute left. So unless we don't have any additional question, we might close here and thank again our two panelists for this very interesting session. And we might start the road. Thank you very much for everybody, for everyone that has been in line, also to attend this very interesting session. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Have a good day.
Thank you.